experts. Hello, everyone. Let's get going. I'm Chetan. I am from micebook. Thanks for joining us on our talks on a Wednesday. We continue to ask the questions of what we can do when. I think we're pretty set, but then I've just spoken to the experts and clearly not. But I think we are. I think we're getting there. So few messages from micebook before we get started, as always. So we are recording this session so we can put it on the podcast and onto our forum. If you can go on mute apart from the speakers, that would be welcome so we don't get the background noise. Objective always, share best practice so we can recover stronger and faster. And we really appreciate honesty from the panel about what we're going to talk about. From micebook, we've got quite a bit going on, and we've got a jobs board that has just been launched. So if you are recruiting or know anyone who's looking for work, we've got a jobs board on there, which hopefully will help people get back into work. We've just launched an event safety sector as well on micebook. So if you're looking for mitigation of live events, whether that's testing and all sorts of other safety services, you can go to micebook.com and search for event safety suppliers. And on the events front, we've got at least 4 events planned, and so I've got a very vested interest in this conversation. So we've got a postponed event, which was from, I think it's postponed 3 times from Christmas, so the Mayfair Townhouse, which we're looking to get back off the ground in May. We've got the V Awards in July. We've got a retreat for agency leaders in June, etc. And I think all of us are here because we want to know what the hell can we do and what can we tell our clients without we don't want to do this in a foolish fashion, because one bad event is bad for all of us. So we want to do this properly and be the professionals we are known to be. So without further ado, let's get the panel. Let's introduce the panel. And the way this session is going to work is we're going to talk generally about what we know are the next steps in the roadmap to opening up for about 20 to 30 minutes. But then really it's kind of you guys asking questions, which I think will be relevant to everyone. Tell us your case scenarios, what events you're working on, what questions the clients are asking, and we can use those as good case studies that will help us all. So I'm going to go to Nick first. Nick, quick intro, where you're from and your expertise.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm a solicitor at a firm called Travlaw, and we specialise in everything to do with travel, leisure. We have to fill lots of tour operators, events management companies. I, in particular, deal with litigation, so disputes and regulatory compliance. So in particular, in relation to what we're talking about today, I'm often looking at the actual legislation, like the actual law behind the guidance. And we often have this discord between what the guidance says and what the actual law says or what it doesn't say. So, I'm at hand to sort of try and do my best to fill the gaps. Thanks,
Nick. Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Threlfall from Brightspace Events. I am an event director, so I've been working in the MICE industry for 20 odd years, and Brightspace Events is a consultancy. I've recently undergone some health and safety training, study and qualifications, and because of that I'm now advising my clients on COVID safety and the return to live events. Kind of looking at event design quite a lot to see how we can get some changes in at the very beginning rather than just trying to do it all at the end, and also working with staff who want to be trained. So I've got a couple of training courses on COVID secure events as well.
Yeah, and Sarah, if you can post that in the chat, that would be good for anyone who wants to pick up. And what I love about having Sarah on these things is because she comes from an events background, and really gets what we do as an industry. So that's brilliant. And Raff.
Hello there, I'm Raff. So I'm a freelance health and safety consultant. I work in the event industry primarily, more towards the side of festivals and outdoor events mostly. Some indoor events, music. I also assist kind of bars, restaurants, licensed premises, and film and television sectors in my spare time. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And yeah, good to chat to everyone.
Thanks, Raff. So as I said, we're going to do quick 20, 30 minutes on what we know is the opening up of the different steps. But if you've got specific case studies, specific questions, you've got an expert panel here ready to answer, so stick them in the chat and we will try and get to them at the end of the session. So let's start with, and this is very quick actually, what can we do now, if anything, up until the 12th of April? Raff, you're on screen, so why don't you take that one first?
Nothing, basically. No, very little. So the step one bit is really it's a continuation of almost lockdown, but you can leave home now is the main thing. But the legal limits being no more than 6 persons or 2 households outdoors, basically, and very similar to what we've been used to over the last few months.
Okay.
The good news is that we did manage to, or rather HBAA, I know, did a lot of work to get an exemption for inspections. So I think that kicked in on the 29th. So we can go and we can talk about what we might do. But if I'm right, I think that was only inspections for business events. So the stuff I saw said, this is, you can go and inspect in a venue that's shut for a future business event, but not for a social event. But I don't know when that changes. So I don't know, which bit of the changes would change that. Maybe step 3 when we get to just doing bigger events anyway. But at the moment, inspections, it does say specifically only for business events.
Yeah, well, that's a good point to raise, is that you can now do site inspections. And I think most of this audience would probably have more business events stuff anyway. Okay, let's move on then. So Sarah, staying with you, 12th of April on to the 17th of May, what changes?
Hang on, let me get my little grid. So the change there is outdoor events. On the 12th of April, I think we're up to, this is now according to the recent guidance for local authorities that was issued this morning. So forgive me if I'm a bit rusty, not rusty, but not quite up to speed on it. So it said on the 12th of April, an event can take place if all 3 of the following conditions are met. The event takes place outdoors, people arrive in a staggered manner, and it doesn't involve people converging on a central stage or something. So the specific examples were things like agricultural shows and food and drink festivals. I don't know if anybody's, but nothing really that affects the majority of MICE planners or clients, unfortunately.
Okay, and it's still a rule of 6, isn't it?
Well, and throughout this, whenever business events are kind of up and running, or if they're a business organising a social event, the instruction is that the social limits have to be adhered to within those bigger group numbers as well. So, but yes, that's where we're at on the 12th of April.
I think it's 1 person indoors as well, up until step 3, maximum of 1 person indoors and 6 outdoors. So yeah, I mean, obviously that 1 person is a gathering all on their own, so they can they can separate. You could have multiple lots of 1 person, providing they don't mingle. When
you say step 3, does that mean the 17th of May? Up to the 17th of May, sorry.
I believe so, yes. The final step under these regulations, yeah.
Okay. If anyone's got anything they think that they need some answers on before the 17th of May, then pop it into chat and we can revisit and spend a bit more time uncovering what you might be facing. But I don't think there's many people here, but if you do, pop it in chat. Nick, anything to add up until the 17th of May?
Nothing of any interest to our audience today, I'm afraid.
I mean, we did have a quick kind of back and forth, didn't we, Nick, where I was trying to see if I could squeeze something out of the legislation for now. Right. But ultimately, you sort of said that the reasonably necessary section means it's very hard to justify why people can't be doing this remotely, and why they physically have to be in a room. It's quite a high justification, but it is there. So I guess it's say training, something like that, where you have to be.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's exceptions, isn't there, for people who can't actually work from home and have to go into their work environment. And typically with offices, most offices can work from home if they've got remote networking. But yeah, strictly speaking, you can have business meetings internally, possibly bringing in external people, but it's just that word necessary, only when it's not when it's necessary to be in person. And I just really struggle to think of any scenario in this day and age with all the technology that we have where someone can really justify and say it's necessary to have this meeting, even if it's internal or some sort of business transaction, you know, to do that in person. I'd like to hear suggestions on people who think, yeah, I really need to do this in person, but you know, feel free to change my mind. But yeah, I think that's a high bar.
Okay, let's go on to where it hopefully does become interesting, which is from the 17th of May. So our first event that we're planning is on the 19th of May. Tell me what can I do and what do I need to think about, which hopefully answers a lot of questions for a lot of people. So that 17th of May to the 21st of June. Nick, stay with you.
Stay with me, right? Okay, so this is where it starts to get a bit more interesting. So we've got our guidance, which came out yesterday. So what can we do? So events and activities such as business events, such as conferences, trade shows, exhibitions. So this all sounds like stuff that people here will be obviously really keen to get going again. There's other examples, private dining events, charity gala dinners. Then you've got the more social side of things, which I guess we're less interested in, like cinemas, live performances, possibly. I don't know, entertainment side of things like circuses, air shows, these kind of things. And again, we have this very muddy, something we just discussed earlier, the three of us, about this ongoing rule of 6. So we've got this kind of rule of 6, which carries on for indoor events, and this outdoor limitation of 30 people. But at the same time, we've got a capacity limit of 1,000 people, or 50% of the venue's capacity. For indoor, and for outdoor, it's a maximum of 4,000 people, or 50%, whichever's lower. So having just thought that through just in the last few minutes, you know, so new is this guidance, my guess here is actually that this ongoing rule of 6 for indoor or 30 people outdoor, I'm guessing that must be for certain types of these events like cinemas. So I can understand that, where if you go into the cinema, you should stay with your immediate bubble of friends or whatever, or maybe the circus. But surely once they actually pad out and draft some legislation to put some meat on the bones of this guidance, I think that for things like conferences, trade shows, exhibitions, I just can't see how in practice it can work in them sort of bubbles, especially if everyone's going on the road of, I don't know. So I think possibly there might be sort of distinctions for different types, but we'll have to wait and see when the legislation is drafted, which probably will not come out till a week before the 17th of May, given the form the government have got for doing so. Maybe even on the day before, knowing, or like I say, what we've had.
It does mention for step 3 that you have to ensure social distancing, and it says if there's any risk that there's not, you can't ensure social distancing, then it can't go ahead. So I think they must be assuming that at step 3, even with those numbers, each household group or each kind of rule of 6 group has to be socially distanced from the next group, but they don't have to be socially distanced amongst themselves, I guess. Is that
to me, Sarah, sounds most likely, because that was essentially the state of play that we had last summer.
So then if you extend that into business, as long as each individual is distanced, you don't need to worry about a rule of 6.
I mean, theoretically, if you could go to a pub with 5 of your friends and sit at a table, I don't see why you couldn't go to a business event with 5 of your colleagues and sit at a table. But as Nick, that situation isn't there yet, so we don't know.
Well, and you could you, if you were a close cohort, because I've had that before at events where, I've said to people, excuse me, you need to be distanced. And oh no, it's all right. We're a cohort at work, so we don't have to distance. And actually that's not the point. Right now you can distance, so you should be distanced. But you could end up with that as well, couldn't you? People who in, I don't know, hairdressers or whatever are close together suddenly think that none of it applies to them when actually they're in a different situation now.
And under the working safely guidance, that there is that thing of maintaining other controls, isn't there? So if you are unable to maintain distance, and you should try and maintain other controls like face coverings or similar.
Yeah, I've seen quite a lot of things like that. I mean, you'll know more than me. I've seen references to ventilation, making sure there's good ventilation and regular cleaning, and a long list of things that they need to make sure the people who are in control of the premises are well on top of.
Yeah, my standard COVID risk assessment now goes to 20-something odd pages. So I think it's fair to say there's quite a bit you can do there in practical senses, but it's yeah.
And where do we think the relationship is between the people who actually run the venue, organising the event, and you've got all these middlemen in between? Ultimately, it's going to be on the people organising the event, I think, is it? To make sure everything below is done correctly.
Yeah, so that they do cover anyone in the specific regulations. They do go over, and this is something they've lifted from prior regulations. They've gone over the different roles so that people like managers of venues can be held accountable as well as the organiser themselves. So in essence,
me then, Raff, that one, because I spotted that yesterday and thought, oh, have I just missed that before? Because there is this question as to who's responsible for the risk assessment. Is it the venue or is it the agent who's booking it?
It was I believe it was in the number 2 regs last summer. So I think there was, to the best of my knowledge, as I remember, it's been a while since I've looked at those older regulations, but to the best of my knowledge, that the idea was that in our events, for example, the promoter could be held liable by an enforcing authority, as they could for a Health and Safety at Work Act breach, but also any venue or any the manager of a venue, if they permitted an event to go ahead. So there was almost how can I express this best? A secondary layer of enforcement from venues onto bookers, basically, ensuring that all the I's were dotted and T's were crossed, so that they weren't putting themselves at risk of a fine or a prohibition notice.
Because you've accepted that booking, so you've accepted that risk, so then you have the legal responsibility to.
Yeah, I mean, how often that actually turns into a prohibition notice when, if an EHO turned up, I don't know. But I think it's more of a stick than a practical. I think in reality, if a council are very much, certainly the councils I worked with last year in the summer, were very much keen to identify the lead person and say to them, this is all on you, very similar to the Health and Safety at Work Act responsibilities. This is on you, and you'll be the first person we fine if a breach occurs.
Well, that's certainly how, as I would expect it. The last thing the government want is for everyone to be playing the blame game, pointing at each other, and people falling out. So I think they just want everyone to be, clearly responsible. And
I agree. Yeah, I think, to be honest with you, it was more about having those provisions in the regulations is probably more about when an EHO or a police officer turns up and they can't really identify who's in charge, and everybody starts playing the blame game. They can sort of pick the person they see at the time of being in charge and find them.
Yeah. I mean, here's a question for both of you guys, or anyone really who's here, because there were pilot schemes lined up or proposed last year when we were trying to get back and go in September. Does anyone have any knowledge of anyone who actually got picked for those pilot schemes and saw on the ground what was being discussed and planned out? And obviously it didn't go very far, but I don't know if anyone gleaned anything from that or has any knowledge of what happened.
I know about this year's a little bit, but not last year's, I'm afraid.
Oh well, even from this year would be more interesting, I suppose.
This year, I know they've got one of the first ones they've announced is the World Snooker Championships, which will be interesting because it's quite a drink-heavy crowd, shall we say, that actually go to those events.
And it's long as well, isn't it? From what it takes ages, so it's not like you're in and out again.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, Sarah, I know me and you have discussed this previously, but this whole idea of there's a testing requirement being attached to a lot of these trial events that I think in reality is not going to prove to be scalable or be useful to anybody, really. So attaching that early with these trial events, I think, is quite a dangerous thing for the government to do.
Let's come back in a second. Let's go back just to the question, and we'll come back on testing, and we'll come back to pilot events in a bit. So from the 17th of May, we talked a little bit about who might be, basically we need to have lots of risk assessments and mitigation in place, whether that's distancing, whether that's masks. From what else I can understand, it's 50% of capacity of the venue, and staff are not included in this number. And catering, I've got a note, catering is permitted in groups with table service. Can anyone shed any light on those factors, and what, if I'm reading that, can I use that as my guideline? So I need all of those measures, plus as long as it's 50% capacity, up to a maximum of, I think it's 1,000 people indoors. Is that right? As long as it's below 1,000 people, then it's 50% capacity. Can I work with those those parameters?
I think so. But the biggest risk in all of that is that the date moves, because as soon as that they say, actually, no, the data is not what we want. We know that the vaccination rollout is going to slow down, because they said they're kind of going to go back and start doing seconds rather than firsts. So if any of their tests don't tick the box, then that date, moves. And all of a sudden, if you were planning to try and fit something in that 17th of May to 21st of June window, you're potentially knocked back. We don't know how long. And as Nick said, they don't really give much notice. I mean, they said yesterday or day before yesterday, wasn't it, about the 12th? So they're doing it a week before, whether they say yes or no to a step. So that's the biggest risk, if you like, is that it just doesn't happen. You've got it in the diary and they say, actually, no, we're staying here, because it's such a big jump. Your plan B, how you can't really plan B that one, because it's such a drastic contrast.
Okay, and so that's definitely something to bear in mind, is the risk, and whether we feel there's confidence that these dates will get pushed back. The last two haven't, but that doesn't mean the next one won't. What about this catering permitted in groups with table service? How would you do? So say, I'm just using my own example here. I want to do an event for event professionals at a venue, 50% capacity, fair enough. But how would you do table service? So basically have people on individual tables and they get served and they have to stay put, and tray service is not possible. I mean, is that right, Raff? You're nodding.
Yeah, the regulations say that the people have to be seated for the service of food and drink, but they also say that the organizer must take reasonably, steps so far as is reasonably practicable to ensure they stay seated. So I'm not sure whether that will be a stewarding requirement, for example, or service staff saying, notices on tables. There could be various practical ways you could achieve that, but I think it will be a seated. It will have to be seated formats for food and drink in step 3.
Okay. Does anyone else? I know there's questions coming into the chat, which I will pick up on, and I will go back to all of those, a bit about exhibitions, the pilots, etc. But has anyone else got any questions between 17th of May and 21st of June that they want to pose to the panel? Anything they're planning or thinking about that they want to ask? Before I move on, and if there's waiting for any questions, is there anything else to keep in mind from 17th of May to the 21st of June from you guys?
I don't think so.
I think you just made the point then, didn't you, about staff? It doesn't include staff in those numbers. So obviously there's a lot of staff involved, and we don't have to worry about that. That's the only point I was going to maybe mention. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, then let's go to the last step, which hopefully, fingers crossed, happens. Tell us what happens, Sarah, give us a shout on what happens 21st June onwards.
Depends whether you want to believe the media or what Raff and I think might happen, I suppose. Under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, an employer has a responsibility to keep people safe, okay? And that's not going to go anywhere, no matter what Boris does. COVID isn't going anywhere. It's the legal restrictions on gathering numbers that they've said they will aim to review and lift. So although they may remove a legal restriction to gather more than 4,000 or whatever people, so you can bring them together if you want. Nobody's going to arrest you for bringing together more than 4,000 people, but they could still have an issue with you if you've done it in an unsafe fashion. So I think, and also conversely, they would be mad to lift the legal restrictions that are currently keeping us safe, and also remove the organisers' responsibility to keep people safe, because they've taken everything off in one foul swoop. So there's some modelling out. I mean, Sage issued some modelling data yesterday, which said that once we lift everything on the 21st of June, there's potentially some not very nice graphs that happen, because we've only got to where we've got to so far based on lockdowns and restrictions and things like that. So it's uncharted territory if they remove everything. So I strongly believe that although they will remove the legal number limit, there's going to still be a real requirement for us to risk assess and make our own decisions. I think that's the difference. They won't make the decisions for us. They will say, right, it's up to you and your risk assessment. How many people? Do they wear masks? Do you test them? Although that, I don't know, that may end up being a mandated thing. Are you social distancing? And it becomes then a normal risk assessment. It's sliders. So if you can't do one thing, you have to make sure you're doing something else, So that's what I think will be the case in point after the 21st. Or no earlier than the 21st of June.
Yeah. Raff, anything to add?
Yeah, so I think I absolutely agree with Sarah, but I think there's another crucial date that we need to remember, and that's the 17th of July, which I know we discussed in the pre-chat, which is that, we know that the number 3 regulations that permit local authorities to essentially ban events at the discretion of their Director of Public Health remains in place till the 17th of July. At the earliest, and that that may be extended as well, depending on as Sarah said, there are a number of factors which could lengthen this process. All the time that they exist, there's a very easy sword of Damocles hanging over any event, that if the authority were not convinced that the organizer was taking the practical steps, they could can your event very easily. As Sarah rightly points out, though, there is Health and Safety at Work Act as well, which will, and interestingly, that's how enforcement with coronavirus started. I mean, one of the first prohibition notices I remember hearing about was in the Department of Work and Pensions offices, where people weren't able to socially distance, and the Health and Safety Executive issued them with an improvement notice under Section 2 Health and Safety at Work Act. So it wasn't, or for breaching their Section 2 obligations. So it wasn't. It didn't actually start out with these kind of specific provisions. So I think there's already precedent, if you know what I mean, for continuing using Health and Safety at Work Act. The thing I would say, which I'm optimistic about, is that the data we're currently seeing shows us that vaccines are very effective at reducing serious illness. So almost entirely effective at reducing serious illness. And when this virus becomes something that on your risk assessment you can take down from, if you do a 5-point risk assessment, you can take it down from a 5 or a 4, depending on your audience profile, down to something like a 1 or a 2, where it might make someone sick for 3 days, but it's not going to put them in hospital or permanently damage them. Then we're in a different position in terms of assessing that risk. So I think, sticking with those primary risk assessment protocols, like Sarah says, is an absolutely good way to go, but there is optimism there as the vaccine gets rolled out. And the main things I'm looking for, I actually just pulled up a COVID plan I wrote for somebody the other day. So things I'm looking for are things like variants of concern, which affect vaccine efficiency, slowing down in vaccine rollout, large increases in case numbers at a local or a national level, or combinations of COVID mixed with pandemic flu or anything like that could cause an issue. So they're the kind of long-term things I'd be looking at and planning for.
Yeah. Nick, any final comments on 21st June onwards?
Yeah, well, I agree with everything Raff said there. Definitely don't think that it's going to be the end of everything in June, July. And yeah, local authorities have got this ongoing power. But one thing I think, and this is maybe borders on some speculation, but I don't think it's completely unwarranted. There's a website where you can put on your when you were due your vaccine. So the estimations for the young crowd, like under 20s, it comes to like end of September, maybe October for having the second vaccination. So we find ourselves in this position where, as of June, we're sort of saying it might be business as normal. But it also strikes me like it's a classic thing from that old TV program, Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, where the government start off in one position and end up at the other. So they start by saying, we will not have vaccine passport certification for events or pubs or so on. And then they say, oh, we're considering it, we're taking advice on it. And then they say, we're going to maybe we'll leave it to the events organisers to decide. And then slowly but surely, suddenly you've got a system where they've been talking about it recently, haven't they, where either you've had the vaccine or both vaccines, or you've had a negative test in the last 3 hours, or you are an exception for maybe if you are pregnant or for some other reason you can't or shouldn't have it. So, I mean, that opens up another can of worms in terms of, who's going to organise that if that came into play. And but it just, like I say, I speculate, but I feel like that is something that seems a possibility, especially if, like Sarah made the point at the start, is to go from nothing to everything in this space of time. It feels like a big leap.
Yeah. Well, and then you've got, from a vaccination picture question, you do your risk assessment. You'd like to do it, like Raff said, in that overall risk picture. So what percentage of my audience are going to be vaccinated? But you don't know that until you've asked them, and you don't usually do that until much closer to the event. You can make some assumptions based on the normal demographic of my audience but it's not always going to give you the figure that you could really do with to say, actually, is this a vulnerable audience, or are the majority double vaccinated? So that's a real tricky chicken and egg one for organisers.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
All right, what I'm going to do, let me, I've got a few posts in the chat, and let me get people up on and off mute and come up on and ask a question or make points. So Sue Gold, you've made you've got a question about exhibitions, and you've also made a post about the test events. Let's hear from you. And Marjorie, if you also want to come off mute, make a point or a comment, that'd be great. And Liz Johnson. So whoever's ready.
Hi everyone, it's Sue here. Can you hear me okay?
Indeed, yes.
Okay, thanks. With regard to exhibitions, it's really wondering if a trade exhibition would be classed as essential. Obviously, even if you're going to keep it within the UK, because I think, the thought of international travel, we're going to have to be patient and wait a lot longer for that. So that was really an earlier question that I asked. I don't know if the panel have got any thoughts on that.
I suppose the first question is, when is that hoping to happen?
I'm just asking in general at the moment.
Okay.
It's not specific.
I mean, the reference to trade shows appears at step 3. So it says business events such as conferences, trade shows, exhibitions. It's specifically mentioned there, which would suggest that any time before that, it's not considered essential.
So that's 17th of May. Is that right? Onwards at the end.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not sure if the word essential necessarily comes into it. I think it's expressly banned until the 17th of May. There's like a blacklist of events that are business that are prohibited, and I think that gets put from the blacklist to the whitelist on the 17th of May.
Oh, okay, great. So we've actually got a bit of black and white to work with. We don't often have that, but that's good.
I'm just looking at my notes for these new regulations that have just come out, and I think I very much agree with you too. That I think step 3 is realistically going to be when this happens. I mean, you may be able to apply you may be able to apply some kind of exemption if it was very small and a work requirement. If you were only demonstrating one product and you wanted to have one person at a time come and look at it, maybe. But I think, I think step 3 is realistic, the realistic expectation.
Okay, Marjorie, do you want to come on? I think you made a point.
Hi everyone. Again, a kind of general point really. Just interested because obviously the G7 event is going to be attended physically in part by some of the attendees and guests. because that's before the June deadline, I was just curious if anyone had any knowledge of it, or which mitigations. I think Liz said that it will be treated as a test event, which is fairly obvious. If it's sorry, I didn't mean that sound rude, Liz, but if it's a government event, then obviously they're treating it as a test. So just wondering if anyone knows if we'll get any learnings from that. Will it then set a blueprint for how events will be run? Just curious, really.
I mean, how it's actually going ahead in step 2, we haven't touched on it because I didn't really think it'd be relevant to this, but in step 2 there is actually, they introduce a power for Secretary of State to exempt certain events. So that will be how they're running the G7. They'll be doing it under a Secretary.
A handy little clause, that, isn't it?
Yeah,
Unless it's something we want to do, and then it's allowed.
Yes, yeah. I don't know, obviously, because it's heads of state and things like that. I think, to be honest with you, the likelihood is that it will be very tightly and centrally managed by government, and it won't be something we get to know the inner workings of to a greater degree.
Go ahead, Liz.
Just to add on that, having been slightly involved with one or two things to do with the G7, excluding the head of state, anything that's supporting it's having to be looked at in a completely COVID secure manner. So if you are resources to other agencies that are working on the G7, you have to put in all the normal COVID testing and social distancing and everything with your staff and with other teams that are supporting the event. But that said, up until at least 2 weeks ago, which was the last time I spoke to somebody on this event, the information for the suppliers that were supporting it, which I'm not one, so I can't comment on that, was still very vague. But obviously the discussions were opening up and were ongoing. So that's my understanding of how the G7 is operating. And certainly from a local perspective, it is very much being still totally 100% going to be a face-to-face event. Whether there is also people joining virtually, I'm sure there will be, but not as a virtual event, as a face-to-face event, with the opportunity, I guess, for other people to join virtually who maybe cannot travel for whatever reason. So
even if it gets this Secretary of State exemption, I think Sarah's point was really important earlier, which is that, Section 2 and 3 Health and Safety at Work Act still apply. So,
exactly, and the part that I was involved in would have come under that part of the Act, and everything had to be, it was basically support services to a particular part of the G7, not the actual attendees. And everything, like you would run a work canteen or a work cafeteria, it had to be run in those COVID Health and Safety at Work Act ways, yes. Both not only for the suppliers that were providing it, but the people that were going to come and partake in the activities at it, i.e. catering.
Yeah, no, I can imagine.
Yeah, we're talking to one of the agencies who are going to be appointed, so we're trying to get to see what we can get in terms of learnings, but obviously it's very top secret and very early stages at this stage. Marjorie, you mentioned that the Liverpool comedy event might be pulled. Can you give us some insight, or someone else has got some? Wendy, maybe?
Saw an article, I think it was last night I saw the article. I think Wendy copied and pasted it actually, and it's due to the passport discussion, let's say. I just saw briefly that one of the events was a business event. It's all at ACC Liverpool, isn't it? And then one was a comedy club, but the comedy club organisers pulled it. But the article's in the chat. Wendy's helpfully copied and pasted it in there. As far as
it was a PR thing. Well, it was a PR concern they had, wasn't it? They were getting a lot of negative stuff about how diversive these vaccine, then what they call them properly, COVID certification status or COVID status certifications.
Yeah.
Official.
Have we got Susan? Susan, I know you were involved with the pilots last year. Is there anything that was of any interest that actually is relevant now with the new set of pilots? Anything you can share, Susan?
I think it was so new and everyone was so fearful. This is back last September when we were aiming for an October opening date, and now what are we, 6 months on? We've got so much more learning, so much more knowledge. Those pilots were very, it was really all about the testing, or basically temperature testing on arrival, social distancing. Catering was very much a socially distanced 3 to a table possibly, and more like the picnic box type scenario. It was like everyone it was just so new to everybody that I think these pilots would be a lot more advanced in their, because we know so much more now from 6 months ago. And then nothing happened anyway, so nothing opened up anyway, so they all kind of were a bit of a waste of time in a way. And it's so long ago now that these pilots will determine a lot more about how events can be run when they see the results of potential cases and things like that. But I know Amsterdam have had some pilot events and they had no cases whatsoever after, I think it was a 300-400 person event. Yeah, last month.
Barcelona had some too.
Yeah.
Yeah, Barcelona had that big, I saw quite a lot of imagery of that festival or that concert, was it? Or last week, yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure it's really actually very helpful in reality, these pilot events, to be honest with you. I'm a bit of a skeptic about these. But,
Well, because they're kind of unrealistic scenarios. That's
well,
kind of...
yeah, if you, I think my sort of view on it is that if you take testing as being needed because you have a largely unvaccinated, thus susceptible audience, who are going to be unable to have other non-pharmaceutical interventions, distancing, masks, etc. Then the question is really what kind of tests you're using, and the answer seems to be everyone's saying lateral flow. And the problem with lateral flow is that you're missing approximately 40% of the cases a PCR would miss. And if you've got a largely unvaccinated and susceptible audience and you're missing 40% of your potentially infectious people, you've got a recipe for super spreader events all over that. So all of these pilot events are attempting to avoid that by doing other NPIs and testing. And we bring this testing requirement in and essentially you're in a position by the end of this where we go, okay, well, either we don't know whether it's the testing or the NPIs that have reduced cases or have stopped cases. And even if we did, if the testing, if the data for the testing is that it's not that great on lateral flow, so we can't take the risk. And if we're saying that, okay, well, there's basically no risk anyway and everybody's vaccinated, then why do we need to pay loads of money to do the testing? It really does boil down to a kind of scalability and practicality thing as well. It's that so far as is reasonably practicable bit.
Does
that make sense for everyone? So I know it's a bit complex the way I've expressed that. But.
No, it does. Thanks, Raff. Sally, can you come on and tell us about your example you posted in chat? Because I think that's a really good case study.
I'm slightly terrified about doing this event in July, to be honest. It's normally we do this and it's normally fine. It's an international mobile gaming event. It's crazy. It's bonkers. It's normally like 2,500, 3,000 people. My client's going gung-ho, excellent. There's going to be no restrictions from June. Let's go for it. Sal, go and plan it. And I'm like, whoa, hang on a minute. Things are going to be lifted. But as Sarah said, there's still going to be all those things that we've got to stick in place. I'm just not sleeping because I'm worried about it. And we're doing it at the Brewery in London, which is a fabulous venue. We've worked with them for the last 5-6 years, so I know it and I trust them really well. But again, it's not the most practical of venues to move people around. I guess I'm just panicking and I probably just need some what we're doing. Sarah, I've got to start your course. I have signed up for it. I just haven't started it yet.
I'd say the flag that you had there for me was that it's a gaming event. Is that right? It's
a B2B gaming event. So it's not consumer, it's B2B, which does make it different.
Fine. Okay.
Yeah. Not consumer.
Yeah, it was that audience demographic thing that I was kind of most nervous about, is that what's your percentage of vaccination status going to be?
Yeah, you're probably going to get, going back, you're looking at age range from probably mid-20s to mid-50s, roughly, with a high proportion in that kind of 40 plus.
Yeah, so I think because we certainly won't be able to say with any certainty at that point that you're going to have X% of your audience vaccinated. So you kind of, I think it sounds like you're doing the right thing in terms of, you know, you're planning to have social distancing, you're planning to keep one-way systems. Your ventilation is going to be really important.
Slightly concerned about the basement.
I was going to say it's downstairs, isn't it? Which...
Yeah, can we take the whole thing over and we normally jam pack it full, and their health and safety guy normally goes, Sal, stop putting things in it. Yeah. So I've stripped it all
quite low ceilings as well, from what I remember.
In the basement it has, absolutely. Top floor's absolutely fine. Ground floor level is kind of a weird shape, but yeah, ventilation I'm not sure is fantastic. We can use the courtyard, but again, you then get the issue of if your sponsors are inside in booths. Again, I'm making those bigger so they've got space to kind of have 2 meters plus a kind of welcome area. But then you then get sponsors complaining that no one's in if people are sat outside having meetings. It's kind of this really weird, I mean, head mess, I think, is where I'm at.
You've done more testing and things like that than me, and I know that logistically 12, I mean, are they all roughly appearing at the same time, that 1,200, or can you stagger them across a few days?
It will be over the two, it's a 2-day event, so it will be over 2 days. They tend to, you always get a rush on the first morning. There won't be 1,200 at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. That won't be a thing.
There's a possibility that you might have to make that a thing, though.
That's what I'm wondering, because again, you've got
your planning.
Talks starting, they'll start at 9:30, and again, that tends to be when people want to come in. But yeah, maybe we need to say, okay, if you're buying a ticket, you've got to stagger it, and you've got to stagger it in
I think it's one of those, like I said, kind of right at the beginning, is looking at your event design.
That's what I keep trying to look at it, and then I go, oh god.
Planned arrival slots sound like they might be your friend there.
Say that again, Raff.
Planned arrival slots. So as Sarah suggested, planned arrival slots sound like they might be your friend there. And then ventilation wise, I would just touch base with the venue and make sure that they are running an adequate amount of fresh air into the venue, and it's not just like an HVAC system that's recirculating it. Okay,
fine. Okay, I mean, they're normally pretty good. It's just trying to talk a really gung-ho client and pull him back a bit, I guess.
I mean, the size of this event and location makes, are you in touch, I'm also asking the panel, are you in touch with the local authority about this going ahead and working with them to make sure they don't put that sword down? But is that something or should Sally be planning this, planning to talk to the local authority to make sure they don't get legs ripped out underneath them?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I've never talked to a local authority about an event before, so that'd be an interesting.
What area is it in, Sally?
It's London, so it's
City of London, wouldn't it?
City of London, isn't it? The Bury,
City, is it?
Yeah.
So I think they don't have a council per se, do they? They have they're a specific type of local authority that is City of London Corporation, but they'll have.
The venue must know. I'll talk to them.
They should be talking to their authority, shouldn't they, about new capacity licensing and things like that.
Yes, although COVID-19 stuff doesn't come under the Licensing Act because it's public health, not public safety, which is specifically there in the 172 guidance that you can't use Licensing Act restrictions. So it may be, I'm sure they will be in discussions, but they're not kind of obliged to, the venue wouldn't be obliged to update the authority in terms of their license.
Okay, so I better go and have that conversation.
Yeah.
I'm sure they will be, but definitely have the conversation.
Let's go to two other.
Good
luck, Sally.
Thanks.
Sorry to put in. It's Islington that you need to be talking to.
Islington.
Thanks, Liz.
They're quite a good local.
Thanks, Liz.
They're quite active as well, so I'm sure they'll have. I certainly know down here in where I am in Cornwall, there is certain departments that are dealing with this, and there's certain people that they don't advertise it, but there are people that have been put in place to specifically answer these questions and queries. You've just got to wheedle your way in. Maybe
that's the difficulty, isn't it? It's actually finding the right person within the right department. But that's fine. Thank you, Liz. That's a massive help.
Brewery will probably know who their local council representative is and go in via them. You'll certainly probably find that the easiest way. Sorry to put in there.
No, it's fantastic. Thank you.
1,200 people. They may start inviting you to what's called a SAG process, where you have to actually do it like a Zoom call and meet them. It won't be in person at the moment, but you'll have to send them your risk assessments and talk them through your event plan and how you're going to get everybody in and out of the venue.
I do your course really quickly, Sarah.
So yeah, Sarah's a good person to speak to about that.
Sally, I'll be very, very interested if you could keep us updated and post in the forum anything you're finding. It'll be really interesting to see your journey of how this goes, because I'm sure it can help a lot of us. So yeah, please post in our forum. I've got a couple of questions. Marjorie was asking Nick, any thoughts on the legality of asking for personal info, really, like so sort of vaccinations? You know, where are we on kind of on that question?
Yeah, I've just seen that. So it's a good question. So it strikes me as being like very much a GDPR data protection type of question. So you're saying, and although it's not my specialist area, I know enough of the basics to know that it's, you should only be keeping data or collecting data that's reasonably necessary, and explaining why you're keeping it, for how long, and so on. So I guess it makes sense, doesn't it, to ask certain questions. I guess it depends on the time of the event and obviously what the circumstances are. But if we're trying to do sort of like we were discussing here about demographics and what are the risks of if we've got like a double vaccinated crowd or the opposite. So to some extent, yeah, I can understand that some questions would seem justified and all in the interest of health and safety and so on. I wouldn't be surprised if the situation becomes clearer as we start getting more legislation out, in terms of getting it being set out expressly, because if you are by law, if you are expressly required at some point to start getting some of these details, then you've got it in black and white, that you don't have to too much concern. So my gut feeling is not to have much concern about it, obviously depending on what questions you're asking, when you're asking them, in the context of your event starting, and obviously the usual GDPR stuff with not keeping it for longer than you need or using it for any other purpose, and making sure your privacy policy reflects all this. But certainly if it sounds like a very imminent need for answers on that, that's something I could definitely bounce off our commercial team to for a more comprehensive answer than I can give right now.
Yeah, that'd be great, Nick, if you could.
It's one of the big questions about the whole status certification, isn't it? Is the DDA implications and the forcing people to have medical procedures. And I've thought about, if for registration, to cover it from a ethical side, is that if you ask the question, I think we should give the option yes, no, or prefer not to say, so that you're not kind of compelling people to tell you something that's medically sensitive.
Yeah, I guess if that's leading towards people asking the next question as to, if I collect the information and then say you can't come because of this, then I think we've had similar questions in terms of people going abroad to travel and people having similar policies, and I think that the view on that is that it wouldn't be a breach of the Equality Act, because, well, on the face of it, it would be discrimination potentially, but you'd have a defence on the basis of a legitimate purpose for whatever it would be, public health grounds. There's a solid good reasoning to do so. Obviously that would still depend on the time. Are we talking about this being in July this year, where things are still in the balance, or is it February next year where maybe the picture seems a lot more confident and it's not as high risk? So yeah, there's certainly some interesting questions around that area to be developed over the next few months.
I think also part of the question is about that health and safety law, about keeping your staff safe at work. Will then the venues have any say in admitting people that have either been tested or vaccinated? It puts us all in a bit of a precarious position, really, as to how we then deal with the ethical nature of those questions. I mean, I don't have any, it's just a question really, or query as to, I'm sure probably we've all thought about it.
I watched a really good webinar about this, Marjorie. I'll put it up in The Voice, a link to it, which was lawyers discussing the ethical and legal kind of stuff around this. But I think the general consensus was that the way it's going, which is that there's 3 routes to get your vaccine, your COVID certified status, and that's okay. So you have vaccinated, tested recently, or medically exempt. And they're the 3 things that mean that everybody ends up safe in DDA stuff and ethical questions, because there's not just one question. You know, you've got other routes to get your status certified. They've also said that there's some things they'll never ask for it, you know, like libraries and banks and post offices and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
Okay, we've only got a few minutes left. So Nick and Sarah both love, if you could post any updates onto the Voice Forum around this topic, that'd be much appreciated. Liz, you got a hand up?
Yeah, sorry, and it was earlier on in the chat, but a few people have mentioned about risk assessments, and I just want to flag up that if you are doing risk assessments for your clients, please check with your insurers that you're insured to do so. I've just renewed my events insurance with Hiscox, which obviously is a big provider to the industry. And they're very clear that if you provide risk assessments, they're not covering for it unless you've told them that you're going to be providing it. You can do risk assessments for your own team about, you know, whether they're allowed to travel, whether they can go on site, all of those kinds of things. So again, coming back to health and safety at work, but you are not covered for doing a formal risk assessment, which you're then going to give your client. You need to facilitate it through a specialist risk assessment. So particularly, Sally, with your event, if you're doing risk assessments and you are talking to the council about them, make sure that you're covered before you yourself are providing them, because you could end up, if anybody tries to sue you, not being covered. And it wasn't something I would have looked at. They actually physically asked me as that was one of the renewal questions.
Okay, well, I've got to renew my own anyway, so that's thanks for the heads up.
I mean,
Thanks.
Raff might want to correct me here, but I don't think there's any insurers insuring against COVID at the moment, are there?
No, not to my knowledge. And with regards to the risk assessment thing, it's obviously it's a legal requirement that you have one done. You don't necessarily need to be the one to do it.
No, third-party specialist.
Yeah, it has to be.
They weren't specifically meaning COVID risk assessments, though.
No. I mean, any risk assessment, because you know the COVID regulations refer to the management, health and safety at work regulations, which is what that falls under. It's got to be a competent person that does it, whether that's somebody in-house or an external provider. But I think anybody doing risk assessments really should have professional indemnity insurance, to be honest with you.
Thank you. Thanks on that. I just want to try and squeeze one last question in before we finish. Do the panel have any insights on the local authority consultation process? What events does this apply for? Who's responsible, organizer or venue? From Vicky. Can anyone answer that question in the chat?
I don't mind.
It's a bit too practical for me to answer, I think, that one.
I did quite an extensive one last year. The local authority, it varies from authority to authority area. So they'll have what's called a safety advisory group. It's not on a statutory basis. So they don't hold any power. They are an advisory group. The thing you have to be careful of is that those number 3 regs do exist for the Director of Public Health that holds power. So essentially, you almost do need to treat them as a tribunal in a way now. You never used to have to, but under the purposes of COVID legislation, you almost have to, because otherwise the Director of Public Health might determine that you've not provided enough information. In terms of which events go to SAG, Safety Advisory Group, would be up to the local authority. So I know in an area I'm dealing with at the moment, it's anything over 1,000 people, and anything over 500 has to have an online process that they submit. So sometimes these processes are online, sometimes they're on Zoom calls. You need to check with your authority, basically. And you know, again, because it's not on a statutory footing, I think there's the risk that you run of not contacting them and not notifying them about it is that number 3 regs prohibition on your event. So you could find the rug pulled from under you on the day if you don't notify them. On the other side of it, if you notify them, you're going to have to convince them that the event's viable, going ahead, and all the rest of it. So, you know, it really is a strategy decision in some respects, unless, of course, you've got a legal obligation to notify them under Licensing Act, etc.
Thank you all. Thanks. I'm out of time. I'm conscious up to 4 o'clock. Thank you to the expert panel. Their details are on the Voice Forum. So 3 fantastic experts. Should you wish to talk to them about any of your projects directly, please do so. We'll update the Voice Forum with any new content that comes up and a few things that have been mentioned in this discussion today. Have a great week, everyone. Stay safe. Keep sharing the info. Keep sharing the love. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.